Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 268. This week the questions taken from guides 330 and 331, which covered the French ships of the line Valmy and Napoleon, sitting just either side of the start of the Age of Steam, and then two videos from tours in 2022, USS Iowa from the April US tour and HMCS Sackville from the June Canadian tour, and a guest question or two from the Interwar Ship Design 5 Bad Ideas Fun Friday video. So, let's begin. Prussian Hill asks, given the problems you mentioned the flat-sided first rates encountered with manoeuvrability compared to the tumble-home designs, would you consider the flat-sided first rate design to be a failure? And why or why not? Could you envision a first-rate hull form that would be an improvement over both the tumble-home and flat-sided design, at least as far as sailing ships of the line are concerned? I think broadly yes, the flat-sided ship of the line was pretty much a dead end, a bad idea and a failure, albeit they weren't necessarily to know that at the time. There were a few different ships the French built, as well as Valmy, two other classes with mostly slab sides. USS Pennsylvania, that USA's only first-rate ship of the line, also had similar issues. And it's not just the manoeuvrability issue, it's also stability. And it's a bit of a catch-22, because if you want a unified main battery, i.e. guns with all the same weight of shots, given that we're talking about the age of sail rather than caliber, you end up needing more space on the upper gun decks than you would have done previously, because previously you would have had lighter weight guns, which therefore not only weigh less, but are shorter and have less recoil to them. So you have to extend those upper decks to fit, even if you're using short barrel or carronade versions of the big guns, and that leads to your slab-sided issue. But because the height of the deck is so high above the water, and you've still got all these big masts and yards, and you've got a fairly round hull underneath, that gives you a lot of roll and a lot of stability issues. Now, there are ways to deal with this. When you look at successor designs like Britannia, the last big French ship of the line with auxiliary steam power, although it's kind of returned to the tumble home, it's not as severe a tumble home as you'd see at perhaps most ships at the Battle of Trafalgar. And that's simply because, really, with the hull form and freeboard height and mast rigging of an Age of Sail ship of the line, even if it does have auxiliary steam, there's no real way to get around the stability issues of having lots of big guns up top, other than just make the ship really big compared to old ones. Because if you make the ship considerably larger, then of course you can still have that same width on your upper gun deck, fine, which will allow you to have your big guns there, but you can then reintroduce the tumble home and your lower gun decks can be even wider, so actually quite spacious, but that reintroduces the element of stability that you're missing with the slab-sided design. So it is kind of a compromise when you look at the very last era of Age of Sail-ish ships of the line, because they've gone with the size increase just to solve that problem, and as I said, they're not keeping quite the same degree of tumble home you'd see on something like Victory or even Santissima Trinidad. The only other realistic way you could potentially sort the issue out, apart from obviously putting a wooden belt around at the waterline, which they did with Valmy, would be to invest in some big drop keels and use that to assist with the ship's stability. But quite how you're going to ensure a watertight seal on a set of drop keels on a ship whose hull is still mostly wood and therefore considerably more flexible than iron, well, yeah, that's not a challenge I would particularly relish in having to undertake. Damian Porosky asks, how do they remove and replace guns on ships of the line when they need replacement or repair? How would they have done it? Would they have pulled the cannons out through the gun ports? Would they have tried to manhandle them upstairs or ladders? Would they have cut into the side of the ship? None of those, actually. So this is looking down on the bow of HMS Victory about a year and a half ago. And what you'll notice is just behind the foremast there is a series of hatch covers. Now, there would have been more of these the way the ship was originally configured, but some of them have been configured into stairway accesses for visitors. You can see one of them just in front of the foremast there, but there will have been others as well which are a little bit off screen. Now, those serve for ventilation for the ship during normal activities, but they can be removed. You can lift those grids out, and those will actually then form a central column through the ship. And there's a few others. If you're actually going through the ship, you'll notice internally as well. And so if there was a gun that needed to be put back into the ship or removed from the ship, then the gun and its carriage would be unhooked, untied, unsecured from its attachment to the side of the ship, and it would then be rolled to the middle of the ship, and then you would lower down a rope on a crane. Now, that could theoretically be attached to the ship's masts. More often it would be attached to a crane ship or a crane ashore, and the gun would be lifted from the gun deck it was on, up through the relevant hatches, out and onto land. And then you just reverse the process for putting a gun in. Now, whether you did this with the carriage attached or not, in part depended on the type of carriage and whether the carriage needed replacement, but, you could do either or. And that was pretty much the only way you were going to be able to do it, because bear in mind, some of the heavier guns, like the 32 pounders, they weigh 3, 4, 5, 6 tons apiece. You're not getting those up a bunch of narrow stairs by manpower. Even if you could get enough manpower to physically lift the things, the stairs would give way. And they're not coming out the gun ports either, because again, weight, how are you going to support the back end? And you're definitely not going to cut into the side of the ship. So this is why, one of the many reasons why you have these hatch covers and hatchways all the way down through the ship. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, had America lost the Revolutionary War, what impact would its resources have had on the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars? Well, a lot of it depends on how this has all come about. Is the 13 colonies still a fermenting hotbed of rebellion? Did the war end so decisively that pretty much everyone has thrown their hands up and gone, yeah, okay, that was probably a bad idea? Bear in mind, the mass migration of loyalists to Canada theoretically doesn't happen at this point, but let's say, for the sake of argument, in the spirit of the question, that the 13 colonies are near enough fully loyal to Britain. This has a number of major knock-on effects on the Napoleonic Wars. Firstly, there was a whole issue of trade going on in the Napoleonic Wars. It was one of the contributory factors to the War of 1812, actually. Basically, both Britain and France saying you can't trade with the other guy. So if the 13 colonies are part of the British Empire still, well, there's no question of them trading with France, which obviates that whole issue, and that's also quite bad for France, because a couple of times France was bailed out by big American grain convoys. That ain't happening this time around. With a large section of coast to defend and a rising population in the 13 colonies and Canada, Britain might well have invested somewhat in getting shipyards up and running in some of the usual suspects on the US East Coast, Boston being a very obvious one. And so the Royal Navy might be somewhat stronger with output from American yards, which is going to help secure that coast. And of course, whilst the League of Armed Neutrality is probably still not going to be particularly welcomed, its immediate potential threat to the Royal Navy is somewhat lessened, so you may or may not see the attack on Copenhagen in 1801 by Nelson, because a good chunk of that was driven by the fear of the League of Armed Neutrality, including Denmark cutting off supplies to and from Sweden, which included things like mast timber and tar and pitch and so forth. There's a fair bit of that over in the US. So if the US, or the 13 colonies as they would still be, is a part of the British Empire, well, you've got free access to a bunch of this stuff, so you're not going to be quite as worried. And there's also just population. Now, yes, Britain was impressing people into service, But whilst the 13 colonies don't have anywhere near the population of Great Britain itself, they've got about half the population, a 50% increased manpower pool to draw on, including a lot of coastal areas. I mean, it probably won't necessarily make up for an entirely voluntary Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, but it'll probably go a long way to reducing the amount of impressment that has to be done. Plus, with a major population and, to a certain extent, industrial base and friendly ports to base Royal Navy squadrons out of, the theoretically larger Royal Navy might be able to have a permanently positioned battle fleet or two stationed on the western side of the Atlantic, which might mean that, say, something like the Battle of Trafalgar may not happen in the way that it historically did. Because if Villeneuve takes the Franco-Spanish fleet and hightails over to the West Indies to try and capture British colonies or make them think that they're going to capture British colonies there, I mean, with a British-controlled North America, he might not do that. But if he does, you've got Nelson chasing him, but you theoretically also have the Western Atlantic Squadron, whose frigates might spot Villeneuve incoming. They might then sail to blockade him in place and hold him in place for Nelson to catch up, at which point you might have a joint formation. Well, it's not going to be a joint formation, it'll just be a combined Royal Navy formation, but a Royal Navy formation that is based partly out of what is today the United States, teaming up with Nelson's squadron having come across the Atlantic, and the great battle that decides who dominates the seas for the next 100 years may be fought in the tropical waters of the Caribbean or off the southeastern coast of, again, what is now the United States, instead of over at the southwestern tip of Spain. Rebs Redone asks, knowing almost nothing about the transitional period when steam engines were introduced, but having been exposed to soot and sparks from rail steam engines, I wonder, did the combination of potentially sparking funnels and sails in close proximity actually pose a problem? And if yes, what was done to mitigate it? Yes, it was identified actually as a matter of concern in a lot of early steamships. There were a number of ways to get around it, one of which was to just not operate the sails after the funnels when you were running your steam engine, so furl the sails. Another was to wet the sails, so that would theoretically put out any sparks and embers. And another way was just to try and ensure that you wouldn't get many, if any, sparks or embers coming up. And that could be through grates and filters, through the fact that trunking may not necessarily be entirely vertical. And of course, you've got the fact that your boilers are a considerably further distance from the top of the funnel than you would typically have distance to travel for a railway steam engine. And bear in mind, a lot of the early steam-powered ships were literally using steam locomotive boilers. So that in and of itself may allow the sparks and embers to dissipate, and just running the thing at a pretty consistent rate and pretty efficient rate of fuel burn as well, which will reduce the number of sparks. So there's a range of measures that were undertaken to reduce the sparks in the first place, and then if it was thought inevitable that perhaps there were going to be sparks, then you did your level best to either make sure the sparks didn't land on the sails, or if they did, that the sails were damp enough that it wouldn't really affect them too much. But the occasional sail catching fire from sparks coming out of a boiler via the funnel was a known thing to occur in the 1840s, 1850s, and even 1860s. Fortunately, more so on merchant ships than on warships. Beholder asks, with reference to Farragut and the possibly apocryphal "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead" comment, why were naval mines once called torpedoes, and how, why, when, etc. did the nomenclature change the modern definition and distinction between mines and torpedoes? So the original terminology comes from this wonderful thing, the torpedo or torpedo fish, torpedo ray, electric ray. It's a fish where, at least as far as human interactions are concerned, with you stand on it, you get a violent electric shock, it hurts a lot. They actually hunt using both electrical sensors and stun prey with electrical pulses, but fortunately they're not large enough to consider humans prey. They just like to zap us if we're dumb enough to step on them. And the idea of, step on something underwater unawares, or basically come into contact with something underwater unawares and receive a violent and painful jolt and reminder that perhaps today is not going to be your day, was the first thing that came to mind when people started deploying underwater explosive payloads that would explode if a ship ran into them, and hence they came to be called torpedoes. What we now think of as torpedoes, i.e. the self-propelled explosives that nowadays also home in on your target, those came about initially being called self-propelled torpedoes or locomotive torpedoes. So essentially, in the modern translation, that would be self-propelled mines. And eventually, the locomotive, automotive, self-propelled element dropped off, and we just got torpedo for the underwater weapon. As far as where mines came from, as far as I'm aware, although this bit is a little bit more sketchy for me, there were historically mines dug, as in, literal mine-like tunnels, etc., to undermine castles and cause them to fall over. And then latterly, again, as far as my understanding, in land warfare in the Middle Ages and onwards, there were also mines, as in, again, tunnels dug, and then at the end of which were placed explosives, which were then either detonated under buildings or attempt to be detonated under armies, as well as, just dig a hole, fill it with explosive, cover it over to hide it, and then try and set it off. And these things are all collectively known as mines. So once you had the automotive or self-propelled torpedo, then the stationary units needed to be named something, and mine, obviously referring to the trap underground on land, was already kind of in use, although torpedo had overtaken it. But then as torpedo became more and more embedded in the public consciousness as the self-propelling weapon, the mine term for the stationary explosive that you have to run into before it comes up and kills you became the thing that those are now referred to. Hence, you now have the modern distinction between the mine and the torpedo. Albeit, as I said, that latter one is what I've managed to piece together from my understanding of these things. An employed history major asks, in regards to the plate on USS Iowa stating that 600-foot depth was required for full power, do you know the reasoning behind it? Yes, I do. And while I was over in Bremerton last month, at the time that this goes out, I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to Captain Sequist again, captain of USSR in the 1980s, and I was able to talk to him in person. I got to do an interview in person. That will be coming up on the channel later this month, hopefully, and if it hasn't come out already. And obviously in there, he will actually talk about why this plate is in place, because it wasn't in place when he was the captain. But the short version, and of course he'll have the longer version, is essentially that it was discovered by almost drowning an admiral that, you've probably all seen pictures at various points of various large ships, including Iowa class, with big rooster trails behind them. Yeah, it turns out that's not something that happens all the time. Apparently, it happens when a ship that displaces a lot of water starts moving through, relatively speaking, shallow water. Obviously, the faster it goes, the more water it displaces, the deeper the water the effect will occur in. But essentially, obviously, if you think about the ship's hull profile, the sides of the ship are pushing water out to the side. The underside of the ship, which there's a lot of flat hull there or near flat, is pushing water down. Well, that water can't go down infinitely because there is a seabed. So that energy gets reflected back up again. And it turns out that at certain depths and certain speeds, which obviously they've worked out and it corresponds to on this plate, that energy bounces back up in the vicinity of the stern. And that means that the big jet of water, or column of water that's being pushed by the propellers going aft, gets redirected upwards quite violently, which can make it a very unpleasant experience to be on the fantail. And so after the incident, which as I said, Captain Sequist will talk about in more detail, it was decided that for the benefit of everybody's careers, you would only go to full speed aboard Iowa when the ship was in deep enough water that the reflected energy of the ship passing through would come up far enough back that it wouldn't interfere and cause massive rooster trailing, which incidentally does also help in some ways, because it can tell you if you see a World War II bit of footage of South Dakota, Enterprise, one of the Iowas, etc., motoring away happily and a big rooster trail coming up aft, or even in some more modern ships like big aircraft carriers, that tells you the water they're in has to be relatively shallow. They're not over an ocean abyssal plain or anything like that. Brendan Buersdorf asks, if the US Navy wasn't able to acquire the 20mm oerlikon or the bofors 40mm, do you see there being a timeline where they would press the US Army's 37mm M1 autocannon into service in a navalized form, or would they try and upgrade the 1.5-inch Chicago piano? I mean, it's possible, but very unlikely. When the US Navy set up its competition to find a replacement for the 28mm Chicago piano, they had a variety of entries, but the one that came a very close second, surprisingly enough, when you read the US Navy report, was the 40mm pom-pom from the UK. So, in the absence of the 40mm bofors, they'll probably just adopt the pom-pom, because that's the next highest scoring thing. As far as the 20mm is concerned, there's a variety of options open to them for that, but probably the most likely, or one of the most likely, would be some adaptation of the Hispano-Suzuya, the 20mm that was used in aerial combat, albeit that would be a very fraught and much more difficult process because it was looked into, but they proved to be not anywhere near as reliable as the oerlikons. But hey, if you don't have the oerlikons, make do with what you can, I suppose. C. Babylon asks, do we have solid information on the ratio of Flower class destroyed compared to submarines destroyed during the war? Well, there are multiple ways of measuring that ratio. You could look at the number of Flower class sunk total versus the number of U-boats sunk total, in which case that would be 33 to 785. Or you could look at number of Flowers lost to U-boats versus number of U-boats lost to two ships, which would be 22 Flowers compared to 304 U-boats. That includes U-boats sunk where aircraft and ships were involved at the same time. Or we can look more narrowly at how many Axis submarines were sunk by Flower class specifically, and then obviously compare that to the Flower class themselves. So obviously the Flower class, as we just mentioned, 22 Flower class lost to submarines in various ways, shapes and forms. And in terms of confirmed kills, bear in mind there are some unconfirmed or shares, but in terms of direct confirmed kills, 52 Axis submarines, mostly U-boats with a handful of Italian subs as well, were sent to the bottom by the Flower class. So whichever ratio you use, the Flower class is coming out ahead, but in that latter ratio, if you allow for a few of the unknowns and cooperatives that weren't included on that initial list, you're probably looking at about a 3-to-1 ratio in favour of the Flower class. Kendra Malm asks, how many ships in the Royal Navy actually had Royal in their name? Quite a few, but starting out at the beginning of the Royal Navy, if you go with Henry VIII at least, in the Tudor period and then into the early Stuart period, you have considerably more ships at any one time having the royal name, because back then a lot of royal ships had royal appended to them just to signify who owned them. So like Ark Royal originally was Ark Raleigh because it was built by Sir Walter Raleigh. When it was brought into royal service, it became the Ark Royal because it was the Ark, biblical reference, big wooden floaty thing. Royal belonged to the royal family, but you see a lot of royal ships that are called, insert name here, Royal. So quite a few then. As the Royal Navy becomes more and more an arm of state, that changes. So they do have the tradition of naming a ship of the line, the first ship of the line they build when a new monarch comes along, after that monarch. Now, if you get a particularly long-lived monarch, then you can have only maybe one of them around, but if you have a bunch of relatively short-lived monarchs, you might have multiple ships named for multiple monarchs floating around at the same time. So Royal James, Royal Charles, Royal Anne, Royal William, etc., Royal George, these are all things that are around at the time. And then as you transition more to the last part of the 18th and then into the 19th century, although the royal appellation does still stick around, so you get the Royal Albert in the Victorian period, you also have the Royal Sovereign, which is just a general ship name the Royal Navy usually tries to maintain within the fleet at any one time. And Royal Sovereign, Royal Oak, which comes in pretty much after the Commonwealth period, when we decided we actually rather liked having a monarch because the alternatives were a lot worse. And then you also have the Royalist, one of the HMS Royalists depicted here, again, very much a product of the English Civil War, but HMS Royalist, HMS Royal Oak, and HMS Royal Sovereign are the three ships with a royal name in them that show up the most. So when you're looking at, say, the 19th century, there's probably at any given time half a dozen royal ship names floating through the Royal Navy. By the early 20th century, there's usually anything from 2 to 4. And through the last part of the 20th century, even then, there was usually at least 2 ships with royal somewhere in their title. Although at the moment, I don't think we've got any. Because at one point we did have, obviously, Ark Royal the carrier, both the Audacious class and the Invincible class, but none of the R-class ballistic missile subs were named Royal Oak or Royal Sovereign. Both of those names seem to have stopped with World War II, as did Royalist. We might get one or two of them back for the minute, but at the moment I don't think we have any royal names in the Navy. Vokir asks, when was the first naval battle in the New World, post-1492, and which war was the first to feature a major naval theatre in the Americas? So as near as I can tell, the first major naval engagement in the New World after Columbus's voyage was probably the Battle of San Juan de Ulua, where the Spanish tried to destroy and capture the small trading fleet under Drake and Hawkins, and partially succeeded, although not entirely, much to their consternation later on. Now, in terms of which war featured a major naval theatre in the Americas, that's a little bit more difficult to quantify, because you have Drake and Hawkins, and Frobisher for that matter, raiding the Spanish Caribbean, which would count as a major naval theatre. But at the time that they're doing that the first time round, technically there's no war been declared. And then there's another set of raids that Hawkins and Drake undertake, which is Drake's last set of raids. Now, at that point, England and Spain are formally at war, but at that point, considering you've had the Spanish Armada, the English Armada, and a couple of follow-up Spanish Armadas, whether you can count a raid by a handful of English ships as a major naval theatre in the Americas, I'm not entirely sure. But subsequent to that, the first major war where there's a lot of ships sent over to operate in and around the Americas explicitly for the purposes of destroying other major fleets or fortifications in and around the Americas, you're almost certainly looking at the Second Anglo-Dutch War. That's when you get this battle between the English and French over in the Caribbean, Martinique specifically. This is also when the English take New Amsterdam from the Dutch and it becomes New York. So, yeah, actually quite a significant time between, as far as I can tell, is the first major naval engagement in the Americas and a war with a significant naval theatre in the Americas, albeit, as I said, with the caveat that there are a number of engagements in between which may or may not count as a naval theatre depending on your particular preferences. Introvert asks, which would have had a higher impact factor on the naval war in the Mediterranean? Better leadership in the Regia Marina early in the war, or better quality control in the factories that produce the naval ammunition? I'm going to go right in with solving the gun accuracy problems. Now, whatever fix you have to do, whether that be improving shell quality control, adjusting some of the guns, adjusting the fire the muzzle velocity of the guns so to ensure a slightly slower spin speed, whatever you have to do, or whatever combination of factors you have to do. If you fix that, if you make the Italian guns, particularly the 15-inch, but also to a certain degree the 8-inch, actually have accuracy levels that are about on a par with everybody else's, that will have a much, 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 much bigger impact. Because in the early part of the war in the Mediterranean, the Italian Navy wasn't necessarily lacking for opportunities to do battle. They did take pot shots at Royal Navy ships with a fair degree of regularity. The problem was that, by all rights, the number of shots they took and with the ranging accuracy that they had, they should have hit at least something, and they didn't. If you now change that so that, statistically speaking, they're likely to actually start landing some of those 15-inch hits, that is going to take a big, big change to the battle in the Mediterranean. Partly because, well, if Royal Navy ships are now being hit and damaged, that means every time we come around for the next action, there's fewer Royal Navy ships available, or the Royal Navy's having to pull ships in from other theatres, which has quite a dramatic impact. Whereas, much as I hate to say it, having better quality high-up leadership early in the war, without fixing those gun issues, is for the most part just going to take Italian ships out to fruitlessly blow up patches of the ocean in the vicinity of the Royal Navy on a slightly more frequent basis. So yeah, getting that accuracy level sorted out first, it would make all the difference, I think. And the thing is also, if the Italian Navy goes out and within the first 2 or 3 engagements it's actually hitting and doing serious damage to, or even sinking, British ships at long range, that's going to encourage the leadership organically to perhaps hazard a few more goes at various bits and pieces. So in that case, one leads into the other. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, what is the difference in the role and equipment between a Navy Yard, Fleet Base, Section Base and other levels of naval bases? Is it just a matter of the scale of operations and the number of size of ships that can be supported? To a certain degree, a Navy Yard implies the existence of a shipyard, so it implies the capability for the construction as well as the refit and repair of new warships, as well as obviously, taking care of the ones you've already got. When you move away from anything that has the word yard in it, then you've got fleet, section, and other terms. Obviously different navies use different terms as well, but a fleet base, fairly simply, is just a base that is considered large enough to hold a fleet. Now the thing is, a section base or a station base, like Halifax or something, might actually have considerably more facilities for the refit and repair of ships than some fleet bases, because if you're just using the term base, i.e. somewhere where ships can be located on a relatively long-term basis, a fleet base could be Scapa Flow. It's big enough to store a lot of ships, but with the best will in the world, Scapa Flow, it's not a yard, it can't build new ships, it hasn't got all that much in terms of capability to repair, refit and restore ships. Most of the time they will have to go down to other bases in order to do so, but that doesn't make it any less a fleet base. And you can have, obviously, some ports that have multiple roles. So Norfolk Navy Yard, for example, in the US, as the name suggests, it's a Navy Yard. It has shipbuilding facilities, but it also has ship refitting facilities, which is perhaps unsurprising with the dry docks, but it's also a fleet base. There's a significant portion of the US fleet base there at any given point. And of course, things can change as well. So San Diego and Pearl Harbor, for instance, have varied in importance to the US Pacific Fleet as time has gone on. Chatham Dockyard, for example, has had the capability of constructing ships as well as refit, repair, store, etc. for the Royal Navy. But then at some point during the Cold War, it stopped building ships for the Royal Navy and started just being a base for the Royal Navy, albeit a base with dry docks and everything, so a fairly advanced one. And of course, even within that infrastructure, you can have some surprisingly large infrastructure on surprisingly small bases, because you might have, especially if you're talking about something like the British Empire, you might have either a floating or a permanent dry dock at some point hundreds or thousands of miles away from your home. Now, that facility in and of itself may not be able to support more than a dozen ships of all sizes, but it might have a dry dock that's capable of supporting the largest ship in your fleet. Whereas conversely, you might have somewhere else that has the capability to hold considerably more ships, but the dry dock facilities there maybe can only hold up to something, say, the size of a cruiser. So really, the only commonality you can draw out of these titles is, as I said, if it's got yard in the name, it implies it can build ships, and anything that has base in the name within the hierarchical appellatives that it has will tell you roughly how many ships they expect to support there, but that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how many ships they can rest, refit, rebuild, etc. Daniel Silverthorne asks, how do timed fuse shells work? I can understand early shells using larger and shorter lengths of fuse line to adjust timing for detonation, but how did this evolve into the mechanically fused shells in use for World War II before their replacement by proximity fuse shells? Well, mechanically fused shells work exactly as they sound. So the detonation fuse is, or the detonator, whatever you want to call it, that is exactly the same as you'd find on any kind of high explosive shell. So it's a very, very short detonator. But the time until that detonator is struck, in the case of an mechanically timed fuse, is set by this mechanism, which I've described in a previous dry dock. And essentially it's just a clockwork mechanism at its very core, with obviously some very, very stiff elements to withstand the shock of being fired on the end of a shell. And as you can see, it gets set to a certain time, kind of like a wind-up mechanical timer, and the shock of the shell being fired out of the gun is what triggers that thing to run. So, and it's a very precise item. It might run for 3.1 seconds, it might run for 3.7 seconds, or whatever. And at the end of that time, kind of like an alarm clock reaching its timeout, it strikes the detonator fuse, which then sets off the rest of the shell. And for a while in the era of naval guns in the late 1800s, there wasn't really this kind of facility available, because, as you said, the really old Age of Sail stuff, like mortars, had physical fuse cable or fuse wire that would be set off by the flash of the powder that launched the shell. Now, obviously, that was somewhat limited in accuracy to how long exactly you'd cut that fuse and where exactly it caught fire, and did it go out temporarily while it was arcing through the sky. Once everything was contained within an aerodynamic shell, when you get to the sort of middle part of the 19th century, then things got a little bit more difficult for timed fuses, because you now had these things being internal rather than external to maintain the aerodynamics, and the shells were travelling considerably faster and considerably further, so the old fuse line method wouldn't be anywhere close to reliable enough. So you just had a mixture of armor-piercing shells and high explosive shells that detonated on contact. But then as mechanical capabilities got more advanced and more shockproof, you started to get mechanically timed fuses, and you start to see those obviously on land in World War One. At sea, there wasn't really much call for them until aircraft started to show up, and then all of a sudden there was a call for them, because that was a way, pretty much the only way until the radar proximity fuse, of getting a shell that had missed the target to perhaps detonate near the target and still potentially do damage. Rebel Skverl asks, I recently discovered that the Papal States intermittently had its own navy over the course of several centuries prior to Italian unification. Could you perhaps discuss its history briefly? Well, to be honest, there isn't a huge amount to tell. The Papal States, for those of you unaware, up until Italy became a single country, was a band of territory approximately the middle of Italy, maybe just a little bit to the north of the geographic centre, and a little bit up the northeast coast as well, which belonged to, as the name suggests, the papacy, the Pope, Rome, whatever you want to call it. In any case, as one of the many competing Italian city-states, and one with actually coasts on both sides of the Italian peninsula, the Papal States had to have a navy of some description, albeit that theoretically everyone, at least while Europe remained Catholic, was supposed to respect the Papal States' territory, and so the need for a navy wasn't necessarily strictly as pressing as it was for some other states. Of course, when the papacy decided to get a little bit militant and join in on one side or the other of various wars, that immunity kind of went away a little bit, and of course later on, as you get Europe factionalizing into various denominations, the idea of ultimate respect and fealty to Rome also kind of went away. But to be fair, by the point that that happened, most of the Papal States' strength was quite diminished. The high point for the Papal States' navy was probably around the time of the big wars with the Ottomans. Now, obviously, that went on for centuries, but we're talking about the mid-Crusades up to about the Battle of Lepanto and a little bit beyond. And at that point, the Papal Navy actually had a couple of squadrons to its name, including some relatively large vessels, albeit that they tended to be bought or hired in from elsewhere. They did have a shipyard that could build some ships and maintain considerably more, but the Papal States themselves weren't usually in the business of building big galleys and galleasses when, hey, someone else is perfectly capable of doing it, and then they can just pay for it. Because if there's one thing the Papal States were usually not short of, it was a few gold pieces. But then in the era after Lepanto, once the Ottomans had kind of settled down to occupying their bit of the Mediterranean and everyone else had settled down to occupying their other bit of the Mediterranean, the Papal States' navy began to decline quite rapidly because although they'd never been able to maintain a particularly large navy, you had the increasing coalition of what had been small nation-states into larger nations, plus also the greater industrialization, even pre-industrial revolution, which meant that, you know, a squadron or two of papal vessels before, whilst not the largest navy, might still be competitive enough for people to take notice, whereas by the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, you know, when people, at least in the largest navies, are rocking around with hundreds of ships, some of which are thousands or even tens of thousands of tons in displacement towards the end there, the fact that the Papal States might muster up a couple of schooners and a corvette is negligible. So, yeah, they effectively become an irrelevancy about 50 to 100 years after Lepanto, and they were on a fairly steep decline in that time period between those 2 points. And then, of course, it goes away once the Papal States are taken over by what's now the Kingdom of Italy. Or rather, should I say, Italy, because technically even the Kingdom of Italy went away in, I think it was the late 40s. Ibereg asks, were there any two enemy warships that fought each other more times than USS Enterprise CV-6 and the Japanese Zuikaku in history? There are a number of possible contenders. I mean, Santissima Trinidad and Victory actually faced off against each other guaranteed in 3 separate battles, Trafalgar, Cape St. Vincent and Cape Spartel, and possibly a 4th if you include the Great Siege of Gibraltar generally, for which both ships were present, and that compares with Enterprise and Zuikaku facing off at Santa Cruz Islands, Eastern Solomons, Philippine Sea, and then finally Cape Engano. And there would have been multiple ships in the Anglo-Dutch wars on both sides, Sovereign of the Seas, for example, the big flagships, that would repeatedly meet in the multiple major fleet battles during the First and Second Anglo-Dutch wars. But as far as 20th century warfare goes, I think Enterprise and Zuikaku probably have some kind of record going, because most British ships were bouncing around between confronting the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, so they didn't really have a time to develop a nemesis relationship with one particular ship from one particular nation, and major fleet actions were relatively sparse in World War One. So yeah, unless anyone can beat 4 in the 20th century, 4 separate encounters for larger ships, then I think we've probably got a winner. If there's anyone that's going to dispute that, it'd probably be something like the Georgios Averof. That did face off against the Ottoman fleet quite a few times. Marlin Stout asks, Yorktown was disabled at Coral Sea, taken back to Pearl and returned to service in just 3 days. It wasn't possible to fully repair her in that time, so the yard just did what they could to get her able to fight. What damage did she still carry when she went to Midway, and what effect did that have on her ability to fight or resist further damage when she was hit at Midway? If she had somehow been able to be fully repaired, would a 100% healthy Yorktown have been able to survive the damage at Midway, given the overall toughness the class displayed? So there's quite a range of conflicting opinions. The core information essentially amounts to, as you can see from some of the damage they're patching up, that it's most likely that some of the internal structural warping, so twisted bulkheads, shrapnel damage, etc., was probably not patched up, which would have had a minor impact on her ability to resist flooding, because they were more focused on making sure the fuel tanks were secure again, making sure the leaks, etc., and warping caused by near misses had been patched up, and of course making sure the elevators worked, making sure the hangar had been, and flight deck had been patched up, making sure the big hole caused by the bomb that had come down the middle had been patched up, and of course trying to work out what they could do with the 2 boilers that had been knocked offline during the bomb hit at Coral Sea. So apart from some minor flooding, which would be easier now with the damage, which I don't think probably overall would have affected much, the big debate comes about with these 2 boilers. Now, for a long time, the conventional wisdom has been that those boilers basically weren't repaired because, well, patching up a boiler is quite difficult. But then when you look at various books, some of them will stick with, those 2 boilers weren't repaired. Yorktown was limited to around 28 to 30 knots off of a top speed of 32 to 33 knots, which gives you some idea of just how much power you need for those last few knots. And of course, there is also a limited amount that you can do to modify how much power you're getting from those boilers, because of course steam is used in other things. So if you really need power to get up to a higher speed with a limited number of boilers, you can not use steam in other systems that might otherwise be using it. So, but that's a kind of a by the by. But then a lot of the sources that then argue and disagree over whether or not Yorktown's boilers were repaired at all, and if they were repaired up to full operational status, also happen to disagree quite a lot on what Yorktown's top speed was. So some say that the boilers weren't available and Yorktown could make 28 to 30 knots, depending on the source. Some say that those boilers were patched up but couldn't operate at full efficiency or full pressure, so you could, again, they seem to agree with the sources where the boilers weren't offline, at least at the higher end, and suggest that maybe Yorktown could make about 30 knots if she was really trying. And then other sources claim that the boilers were absolutely patched up and ready to go, but then they variously credit Yorktown's top speed at either 31 knots, 33 knots, which is close, I suppose. One or two will say 34 or 35 knots, which is definitely not the case. And so, if there's a book sitting there absolutely insisting that Yorktown was able to do 34.5 knots because all her boilers were patched up, and you know full well there's no way Yorktown's making 34.5 knots even fresh out of the dockyard, it makes it difficult to take that source seriously. So, I think on the balance of probabilities, whether we're talking about the boilers being completely non-operational, 2 out of the 6, or only partially operational, there does definitely seem to have been some kind of power impairment on the balance of sources, which slowed Yorktown down. How much that slowed her down, whether it was by 2 or 3 knots or 4 or 5 knots, probably largely irrelevant. But obviously, if she can't make absolute top speed, then she's not going to be quite as agile, quite as difficult a target. That might make her a slightly easier one. But then again, if she's able to move at 28 to 30 knots, she'd be a pretty difficult target in the first place. So I think in terms of being able to fight off enemy aircraft, it probably didn't change things hugely, apart from, say, maybe making her a slightly easier target. But once she started to accumulate damage pretty quickly, obviously hastily repaired bits are more likely to fail, whether that be patches over the outer hull, patches on boilers, patches on doors and bulkheads, etc., which would lead to slightly quicker flooding, slightly more flooding than might be expected than if the ship was completely new. And that may or may not have been a tipping point. Obviously, we're not necessarily going to know, to the point that got her to where she was when she got torpedoed. I mean, once she got torpedoed by the sub, that's the end of it. Regardless, she would have been going down at that point between the damage from the air and the damage from that sub. But whether or not the little bits that added up from Coral Sea meant that she was in the position that she ended up in when she got hit by that sub, that's potentially arguable. Michael Gilson asks, how much air conditioning capacity would it have taken to keep Prince of Wales and Repulse's fire control functioning? If some suitably sized air conditioning units had been available in Singapore, say a movie theatre had ordered units that had arrived but not yet been installed, would it have been possible to jury-rig them in, and how long would it have taken? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, because I haven't had a chance to look at exactly the location of the high-angle control system room. What ventilation was there available? Could that have been hooked up to an aircon unit? How easily could the aircon unit have been gotten down there, or gotten to a place where its output could be vented down there? It's, that's all stuff, unfortunately, that I don't know the King George V class in enough detail. However, based on the general principle of the size and capacity of some pretty nice aircon units at the time, it shouldn't have taken more than one or two per ship to keep the basic systems running, albeit, one or two would allow you to keep one line of systems running. If when the ships can take hits, potentially that will knock those offline, which will make it much harder for everything else to get running, which in turn will obviously degrade it a lot faster than if you had the entire system and all its backups all equally air conditioned. Installing them itself wouldn't have actually taken very long. It would, again, be mainly a problem of, can you physically get them down into the area that they're required in? But the other thing you've got to factor in is that by the time the ships were actually in Singapore, the heat had already done its damage to a certain degree. There were elements of the radar and fire control system that were already not working and needed repairs because they had heat damage. So if these systems were going to be installed, you would have to install them, I think, probably at the latest when the ships when Prince of Wales at least got to South Africa, to avoid accumulating the damage travelling through the Indian Ocean in the first place. Bill Brockman asks, I've seen a Bofors 57mm anti-aircraft gun mentioned. Was this gun based on the mechanism of the 40mm? And was it developed enough during World War II? And did users of the 40mm consider adopting it, especially against kamikaze attacks? As far as I'm aware, and bearing in mind this is coming towards the end of the period the channel covers, the Bofors 57L60 is a scaled-up version of the Bofors 40mm, but its development and design history appears to be from 1950 onwards. So that would indicate that it is not going to be available in World War II at all, because if the design period starts 5 years after World War II ends, there's no way it's going to be ready for use in World War II, and therefore no one's going to consider adopting it because, they don't even know the gun exists, or that Bofors may at some point in the future consider working on it. But in terms of the systems, although obviously it is a somewhat newer gun, and even Bofors had brought out an L70 version of the 40mm L60, the 40mm L60 being the one that we all know and love from World War II, there are a lot of commonalities which obviously betray its origins as derived from the earlier Bofors 40mm. one of those being its ammunition feed system, albeit that because the 57mm round is considerably heavier, rather than go in 4-round clips that the way the 40mm did, with the 57mm you fed single rounds into hoppers, which then kind of fed themselves down to the guns. So you had to be a little bit more on your feet with chucking rounds in, but to be honest, once 40mm bofors got going in World War II, that wasn't something that they were unused to, it was just a slightly heavier round. Toreno asks, at the end of World War II, the British government scrapped many historically significant ships, such as the Implacable from the Battle of Trafalgar, HMS Warspite, etc. However, it seems that at least one historically significant ship was chosen to be saved, with HMS Conway, the last second-rate steam auxiliary vessel from the Age of Sail, scheduled to go into refit in 1953, something that potentially would have kept her around until more modern times when such ships were more appreciated. This unfortunately didn't happen as she ran aground on her way to said refit, but why was she chosen for a refit over all the other historic Royal Navy warships, especially considering a few years ago they'd scrapped Implacable and Warspite? Was it solely due to her still being useful as a training ship, or did someone have actual care for preserving her? Pretty much the latter. The cold, ruthless hand of bureaucracy, Conway was still an active school ship. She was an active, if you like, contributing member of the Royal Navy, and as such, her refit came under the more effectively generic heading of the same kind of thing as maintenance of equipment, maintenance of buildings. You know, we have this facility, it does X, it needs repairs to continue to do X. That's a fairly standard line item. Whereas with Implacable, she'd been bouncing around between different roles, but had pretty much come to the end of her useful life as an active school, stores, barracks ship for the Royal Navy. And Warspite was, okay, she wasn't in the best condition at the end of the Second World War, but again, you know, there were lots of ships in better condition if the Royal Navy wanted to turn a battleship into a school ship or store ship. So both Implacable and Warspite were just costs, with the quote-unquote only benefit from a government perspective being that they would be saving bits of history, whereas with Conway it wasn't about the fact that she was a historical vessel at all, it was purely about the fact that she was still in use as a school ship, and if they repaired her they could keep using her as a school ship, as opposed to the much more expensive, which they ended up having to do because she went aground, building a brand new school, well, not ship, but school ashore. T. Berg asks, in your travels and museum crawls of nearly modern naval vessels, I'm assuming you've got some idea of a modern sailor's daily life at sea. How dramatically would that differ from a common sailor in the dreadnought or Great War era, roughly 100 years ago? Now, obviously, these are personal observations based on a very limited amount of observation of the more modern vessels, museum ships, etc., and chats with various people. So if you happen to be serving in a navy that, you know, Royal Navy, US Navy, etc., and you want to offer any corrections or clarifications, feel free to jump in and say so, if you can. But my personal observation is that, generally speaking, the amount of space allocated to sailors hasn't gone up a huge amount. It's a little more advanced than these triple layer bunks you can see here in this picture, which you'd find on an LST. So sailors have, you know, some curtains maybe for their bunks and a fraction more storage space, but not really a huge amount else. Obviously, the quality of food has increased because we now have modern preservation and storage methods, and even in World War I, World War II, when they had refrigeration, they're still relying a huge amount on very processed tinned and powdered stuff, which to a certain degree still exists on modern Navy ships, but a little bit less, because, as I say, modern preservation methods allow you to keep stuff and create fresh food in ways that they could only dream of in the first half of the 20th century. And of course, the modern sailor has access to all sorts of fancy electronic devices which offer a wider range of entertainment than run around the ship or read a book, which were pretty much the only two constant ways of keeping yourself entertained, other than, you know, playing card games and so on and so forth, all the occasional ship's play. However, one thing I have heard, and again, obviously feel free to correct me if this is just me misinterpreting things or it's a narrow band experience, but one thing I have heard is that sailors don't actually have as much free time as they did back in the day, because back in those days you were either on duty or off duty. If you're off duty, well, clues in the name, whereas nowadays there's a lot more paperwork to do and a lot more training that's not directly related to what you're specifically doing right now as a job. And over time, in the more recent period, again, from what I've heard, a lot of that has been shifted away from, okay, well, your training in whatever you need to do is part of your job, so you can do that as part of your duty period, as long as you're not, actively watching a reactor core or something to make sure it doesn't melt down, to, well, that's all secondary stuff, so you're going to be on duty, and then once you're off duty, if you want to stay in the Navy and advance your career, well, then you can do all your paperwork and your additional training and so forth. So obviously cutting into sailors' technically off-duty hours, actually, despite the wider range of entertainment and so forth that's available to them, leaves them with less time to do things that they would like to do other than sleep, and sometimes not even that. So in some ways it's gone a little better, but in other ways perhaps not. But again, feel free to chime in below if you have had a different experience. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and paying attention and sticking around to the end. And, well, I hope to see you again in another video soon. Until then, have fun and be safe.